Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for watching this webinar recording entitled Enhancing the Intercultural Dimension in Teacher Education. My name is Caitlin Haugen, and I am the Executive Director of Global Teacher Education, which is a nonprofit organization committed to supporting the internationalization of colleges of education, specifically teacher preparation. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer Manise from the Longview Foundation so she can introduce our speaker today. Jennifer?
Thanks, Caitlin. It's a real pleasure to be introducing our speaker today. This is our inaugural conversation of the Topical Action Group through AACTE, and we've invited a powerhouse speaker to address the tag today. Ken Cushner is a professor at Kent State University, where he also studied both his undergrad and master's. He went on to the University of Hawaii to obtain a doctorate in curriculum and instruction and cross-cultural psychology. Ken has taught around the world, and more importantly, lately he's been taking students around the world as the director of COST, the Consortium for Overseas Student Teaching. He was a former Fulbright Scholar to Sweden and is a founding fellow and past president of the International Academy for Intercultural Research. This talk is superb, and I think it will spark a lot of questions and conversations within the TAG group. And Ken, we're just really delighted to welcome you to this conversation today. I'm going to hand things over to you, and we'll look forward to connecting both online through GTE and maybe with some questions at the end. Ken, are you there?
I'm here. Well, thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, Jennifer. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to address the AACTE tag. I've been charged with a rather auspicious task in about 30 minutes to try to address the following questions here. What does it mean to be a globally minded educator? What skills do interculturally competent educators exhibit? How do we know our educators possess these skills? What models are available for assessing intercultural competence in educators? And how can intercultural dimensions be infused into teacher education programs to better facilitate the development of globally minded teachers? It's a lot to tackle in one session, but I'll try to do the best that I can. For the last 20 years or so, I've been asking my students to assume the role of a futurist. And that is to project where they see themselves in 5 years and where they see themselves in about 20 years. And then to juxtapose that to where they see the world in 5 years and what kinds of issues and struggles and opportunities the world will be dealing with in about 20 years. I've been doing this for about 20 years myself, and the results haven't changed appreciably over time. And the next slide will kind of give an image of that. In about 5 years, many of my students say they're going to graduate, they'll get a job, many will be married, they'll own their first home, they'll have that new car finally, they will be in graduate school perhaps, maybe some will have children, and some will take that long-awaited vacation that they've put off since they've been students. And in about 20 years, many of them say they'll have a graduate degree, some will have moved into administration or perhaps into a second career. They will certainly have traveled, they'll have their children by then. They'll have paid off their student loans, and with that money, then they can put it into that second home or that vacation home. And then when I ask them to project what's going on in the world in 5 years and in 20 years, these are some of the issues that they present themselves with. There's certainly more conflicts across the planet. There are fuel shortages. We have a greater use of technology. There's some increased global health concerns, an increase in pollution, and the violence continues both domestically as well as globally. And in 20 years, I often get this one world government, which I still haven't figured out where that's come from, but we're certainly dealing with overpopulation, increased conflicts, global pandemics, greater environmental problems, and new sources of energy. And so I start scratching my head here and asking them to take a look at that. What messages jump out of them? And I'll ask you to do that for a minute too. So just take a minute, look at those, and what tends to jump out to you? Well, if you're like most people, you look at that and you say something to the effect of, gee, things are going great for me while the world is going to pot. And there seems to be this disconnect between the life I envision for myself and what's going on in the world around us. And that's where I tend to move from when I'm teaching social studies or multicultural education, trying to help young people and young teachers feel that they are a part, that they are in fact impacted incredibly by what's going on in the world around them. So we talk about things like this. We're living in a world that faces a wide array of problems that really will only be solved if people from many different cultures who speak many different languages and hold many diverse beliefs learn how to communicate with one another, understand one another, and collaborate, or they won't be solved at all. You know, schooling for many years, for the last century at least, we've been talking about the 3 R's in schooling: reading, writing, and arithmetic. Well, as we move into a more global age, schooling really must begin to address a variety of other things, such as multiple perspectives, how I develop the perspective that I have, as well as how others develop the perspective that they have. This state of the planet awareness, so that I have the sense and this understanding of the conditions under which other people live. And really connected to that is understanding the power relationships, so that we're addressing issues around social justice, equity, and that all people have a voice and that can contribute to the conversation. Ultimately, we need to do some problem solving, but we need to solve those problems in a global context. And that then brings us to this, perhaps this proposed 4th R. We might add relations or intercultural relations as a 4th R that schooling ought to address. I want to clarify a few terms before we get started, because there's often some confusion between intercultural and international and multicultural. When we're talking intercultural, we're really talking about a penetration between and among individuals. So there's some significant interpersonal interaction that's going on. And it implies an exchange, perhaps a cooperation, sometimes a confrontation, but there's certainly some penetration and some interaction between individuals. We talk about intercultural sensitivity as the ability to understand or to perceive culture in its context, and recognizing that there are both similarities as well as differences between cultural groups. But that intercultural sensitivity is more of a cognitive orientation than anything else. It becomes more behavioral oriented when we talk about intercultural competence, because that's putting that intercultural sensitivity then into some culturally appropriate behavior that's appropriate for the time, the place, and the circumstances in which we find ourselves in. So here we're beginning to talk about a greater understanding of intercultural communication, and then we want to be effective in achieving our desired outcomes, or in this sense, solving the problems that span our global condition. So intercultural competence is multifaceted. There's some elements of being open-minded and having a genuine interest in other cultures. We certainly want to develop that skill of being observant about cultural differences, but then also knowledgeable. So we have to create some kind of vocabulary and conceptual base so that we're knowledgeable about these cultural differences. We want to have a tendency to resist stereotyping and to expect that there will be cultural complexity involved in the situations. And ultimately, being able and willing to modify our behavior so that people can interact and communicate more effectively with people different from themselves. So in a sense, it's an intersection of knowledge, attitudes, values, and the significant skill set, which is really essential for teachers and teacher educators to acquire. At least for two purposes. One is to assist the young people who will ultimately be responsible for solving some of these increasingly global problems, but at the same time to help to develop rapport and facilitate intercultural interaction in the increasingly diverse classrooms and communities in which we find ourselves. So in this sense, intercultural competence and intercultural sensitivity serves both a global and domestic needs. I'm going to stop for a minute, change the conversation a little bit, but I'm going to assume that many of you have a GPS in your car, and we may take that acronym of GPS and convert it into something that we might be considering globally proficient students. What does it mean to be a globally proficient student? Well, you know how GPS systems work. A GPS works by calculating information really from 3 or 4 different satellites to determine an individual's exact location. We can use this as an analogy to understand how people interpret others' behavior in a cross-cultural context. And in this case, your car or location, or perhaps a cultural object or a behavior, is the object that's being observed. A person from one culture, culture A, we might say, who could be a teacher or another individual, observes and makes their judgment about that particular object or behavior. Then a person from another culture, we'll say culture B, who might be a student, a parent, or another individual, observes and makes their judgment about the same object or behavior. The goal of intercultural understanding then is that both individuals would make an isomorphic attribution or a similar judgment about the behavior being observed. Both individuals then understand the intentions of the individual and the interaction in the same way. So they're accurate in their interpretations of that, just as the GPS system is accurate in identifying where an individual is. The question for us is, how do we get there, and how do we think about embedding it into the education of young people and, in our case, pre-service teachers? So in this sense, we're talking about teaching for intercultural competence. We need to consider it from at least two vantage points. One is enhancing the intercultural knowledge, skills, and dispositions of ourselves as teacher educators or as teachers. But at the same time, we need to begin to think about this in terms of curriculum material, because we ultimately want to transfer this to our students, either future teachers or, for them, the children in their charge, who will ultimately be having to deal and solve some of these global and complex problems. So this may not be so easy, given what we know about the demographics of the teaching profession, as well as what we're learning about the culture learning process. I'll share a comment that a colleague, Milton Bennett, who's responsible for the work in the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity that we'll take a look at in a minute. But a number of years ago, he said this: intercultural sensitivity is not natural, it's not part of our primate past, nor has it characterized most of human history. Cross-cultural contact usually has been accompanied by bloodshed, oppression, or genocide. Education and training in intercultural communication, and we can say intercultural education, is an approach to changing our natural behavior. With the concepts and skills developed in the field, we ask learners to transcend traditional ethnocentrism and to explore new relationships across cultural boundaries. This attempted change must be approached with the greatest possible care. So what do we know about teachers or pre-service teachers? Kind of the raw material that we're dealing with right now. Well, we know historically and traditionally we've been a relatively homogeneous group. The demographics here have not changed significantly in the last couple of decades, even though there are efforts to increase and enhance the diversity of the teaching pool. But roughly 85% of teachers and teacher education students are middle or upper middle class European Americans, about 2/3 of them being women, and in primary and elementary schools up to 90% are female. Most are cross-culturally inexperienced. 69% of white teacher education students report spending all or most of their time with people of their same racial and ethnic background. Fully 3/5 are monolingual, with fewer than 10% claiming fluency in any second language. And that's with the United States now being the 4th or 5th largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. And of all college majors, education majors tend to be the least knowledgeable and interested in international affairs, perhaps along with nursing and social workers. Most teachers tend to live within about 100 miles of where they were born, and most wish to teach in schools very similar to the ones that they graduated in. So it takes us as teacher educators a significant amount of effort to encourage our students to think outside their comfort zone. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Mary Merrifield, global educator and social studies educator at Ohio State University. She looked at what are some of the characteristics that were common among those educators who were seen as effective global educators. And she found that most American teachers of color have what W.E.B. Du Bois called a double consciousness. That is, they had experiences and competence in their primary culture, as well as being an outsider and being able to merge in with other cultural groups. The European American teachers that she found that were effective at teaching across cultures had their most profound experiences living outside of their own culture or their own country. So they had this sense of being on the margins, being marginalized, sometimes being the target of prejudice and stereotypes, similar to what many of the minority teachers or African American teachers experience. But relatively few teachers and teacher educators have had significant experiences outside of their own culture. And that's a concern for us in teacher education. In the last couple of years, there's been concerted efforts to address the international dimension of teacher education. There have been a number of documents and foundational papers over the years that have been written. These are just a few. Social studies educators especially will be familiar with Hanby's work, The Attainable Global Perspective. Longview Foundation prepared a document a few years ago looking at teacher preparation for the global age, looking at what are the skills and the experiences that would be best required for teachers in training. The Asia Society and EdSteps group produced the document Educating for Global Competence, Preparing Our Youth to Engage the World, which focused on the K-12 environment. And then the International Baccalaureate programs have been around for about 40 or 45 years, and they're growing really at very rapid rates in the United States. All of these initiatives have some elements that point to the importance of intercultural understanding. In Hanvey's work, at least 3 of those 5 dimensions, perspective consciousness, state of the planet awareness, and cross-cultural awareness, emphasize an intercultural dimension. In Longview's document, Teacher Preparation for a Global Age, they're looking at encouraging in-depth cross-cultural experiences for every pre-service teacher, that teachers should have deep knowledge of at least one world region, culture, or a global issue, that skills ought to be developed that people are able to teach from the global dimension of their subject matter, so they understand the global concerns, the global international perspectives associated with that. That we really ought to emphasize field experiences that develop global perspectives, and ideally to promote study or student teaching in another country or certainly in a multicultural community. The Asia Society EdSteps document, Education for Global Competence, defines global competence as the capacity and disposition to understand and act on issues of global significance. And all 4 of their recommendations have foundational pieces that address intercultural education. Individuals should be able to investigate the world beyond their immediate environment. They should recognize perspectives, their own as well as others, and be respectful of that. They should be able to communicate their ideas across cultural barriers, and kind of in line with intercultural competence, ultimately begin to take action, viewing themselves as players in the world and participating with others in the world. And then those that are familiar with the International Baccalaureate program know that its primary purpose is to develop internationally minded people who, recognizing their common humanity and shared guardianship of the planet, help to create a better and more peaceful world. And they summarize that with the statement that these individuals recognize that others, even with their differences, can also be right. So recall what we said about intercultural competence, some of the skills required for that being open-mindedness, a genuine interest in others, being observant and knowledgeable about cultures, the tendency to resist stereotypes and expect that there to be complexity involved, and then ultimately being able and willing to modify behavior. So how do we get there? I don't think we've been hitting the mark in teacher education, and I think we've got to begin to think a little bit differently about how we can more seriously and strategically address this across the teacher education curriculum. A couple of things we know about culture learning. Language learning alone is usually not sufficient for developing intercultural competence. We may make the assumption that if somebody learns a second language, well then ultimately they're multicultural or bicultural, but that assumption's not borne out in the literature. So just learning the language alone does not make somebody, or does not help individuals acquire the skills that are necessary for intercultural competence. Cultural knowledge alone does not lead to competence. We could have wonderful books, wonderful speakers, wonderful videos and films. We can get the information into people's heads, but just having that information is not sufficient to change their behavior or to affect people's attitudes towards others. The same with intercultural contact. We assume if we're around difference, that good things will happen. Well, that's not often always the case. And in this case, we can learn from some of the recent research that's been carried out in the study abroad field. Vandenberg, Page, and Liu have a recent volume, 2012, on student learning while abroad. And they point out 3 assumptions that are typically made in the study abroad field. First assumption is that students learn effectively while being abroad simply by being exposed to new and different cultures. So we make this assumption that when individuals get off that airplane and find themselves in another context, they're learning something. It's often referred to as the immersion hypothesis. Related to that then, students come back from their experiences and they report being transformed. I see myself very different. It was a life-changing experience. And we use that as the evidence that immersion then has in fact made the difference. And then so the third assumption then is because most students say they're learning effectively while they're overseas, it makes sense then to focus more on getting more students abroad than on working to improve the teaching and learning that takes place. And we've seen this incredible increase in the number of students who are studying abroad, as well as the number of international students that are studying on US campuses or elsewhere in the world. Again, we're making the assumption that because they're having these experiences, good things are happening. That's not always the case. A couple of things we do know: experience with reflective encounters with difference and the guidance of a cultural mentor seems to be effective or essential for effective cultural learning to take place. And it takes time. The 2-week study abroad trip, while maybe allowing students to see the museums, the monuments, and the mansions, doesn't do much in terms of developing intercultural competence. It's much more a developmental or an evolutionary process rather than it is an evolutionary process. So we might think about how we practice teacher education and think about how we can put this to work in terms of developing intercultural competence. Because in teacher education, we don't assume that we can take teachers and, well, most of us don't assume we can take individuals and in 6 weeks make them good teachers. We slowly help them develop the competence and the confidence to become professionals. And we might consider doing that for intercultural competence as well. There have been a number of tools that have developed in the last 5 or 10 years designed to assess intercultural and global competence. They're listed here. Perhaps there will be references to them available to you through the website. I want to focus particularly on one, and that's Milton Bennett's developmental model of intercultural sensitivity, and then the assessment tool that was been designed or developed for that, and that's the Intercultural Development Inventory, developed by Mitch Hammer and Bennett. So one of the most widely referenced conceptions of intercultural competence, the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity, proposes a continuum from a highly ethnocentric or monocultural mindset on one end to a more ethno-relative or intercultural global mindset on the other end. According to the DMIS, or the developmental model, 3 stages lie on the ethnocentric side of the continuum: denial, defense, and minimization, and 3 stages are on the ethno-relative side: acceptance, adaptability, and integration. The IDI is that assessment tool that's been developed to find where an individual or an organization lies along 5 of those phases: denial, polarization, which was referred to as defense in the model, minimization, acceptance, and adaptation. So in a sense, we're looking at going from a monocultural mindset to an intercultural mindset. Denial, the first stage, refers to the inability to see cultural differences and is evident when individuals separate themselves into homogeneous groups. Individuals at this stage tend to ignore the reality of difference and are often characterized by well-meant but ignorant stereotyping and superficial statements of tolerance. At this stage, an individual's understanding of cultural difference is minimal, and if it's considered at all, is typically attributed to a deficiency in intelligence or personality. There may also be a tendency to dehumanize others, viewing them as simple, undifferentiated aspects or objects of the environment, thus making them easy targets for discrimination, exploitation, or conquering, as we've seen in the past. Defense or polarization, the next stage, is characterized by a recognition of objective or surface-level cultural differences, for instance, eating habits and clothing differences, but is often coupled with a negative evaluation of others. There's a strong dualistic us-them thinking that's often found at this stage, and when forced into contact with others, individuals in this stage often come defensive, exhibiting what we might call a hardening of the categories, and they tend to focus then on small, typically elite samples of the society. Bennett suggests that a paradigmatic shift in thinking must occur for an individual to move from the ethnocentric stages to where difference is viewed as something to be avoided, to the more ethno-relative side, where difference is something that's seen as an asset and sought out. Minimization, which is now considered to be a transition stage between the ethnocentric and the ethno-relative side, is entered into with this understanding of commonality, or this sense of commonality. The emphasis at this stage is on the similarity of people perceived either around physical universalism, and people may say things like, we're all the same, we all eat, sleep, breathe, bleed red, and die, or we're all people of color after all. Or sometimes it's perceived to be around spiritual universalism. People say such things as, deep down, we're all children of the same God after all, whether we know it or not. Minimization is a comfortable place for people to be as they make such positive sounding statements as, I don't see difference, I treat all children alike. Or when you really get down to it, we're really all the same, I don't discriminate. This in reality is a colorblind notion and ignores the very real experiences that some children and their families may encounter that may ultimately impact their learning in significant ways. We can also thank Walt Disney for the "it's a small world" kind of orientation. It's especially difficult to move from this stage of minimization precisely because people begin to believe they're saying all the right things. Yet it's exactly the ability to discriminate that Jenny Mahon has suggested is essential if teachers are to fully understand the influence that such factors as culture, race, ethnicity, gender, or socioeconomic status have on the experiences that students, their families, as well as teachers bring to the context, the school context. Teachers must understand how their own, perhaps narrow or limited perspective and experience may influence their ability to perceive and understand the children in their charge. It's also essential that they understand their own resistance to difference, a characteristic of individuals in the ethnocentric side of that scale. Acceptance of difference is the first stage on the ethno-relative side of the continuum. Individuals at this stage have the ability to recognize and appreciate cultural difference in terms of both people's values and their behavior, understanding that there are variable and a variety of alternative solutions to the way people organize their existence and experience. At this stage, individuals demonstrate the ability to interpret phenomenon within a cultural context and to analyze complex interactions in cultural contrasting kinds of terms. So teachers at this stage might understand that a family or other collective influences might be greater for a Latino or an Asian child than for their Anglo counterpart. They might then temper their expectation that students make their own independent choices on major life decisions and seek out more culturally appropriate ways to work more closely with the student and their family. And then finally, adaptation is the stage where people begin to see cultural categories as more flexible and become more competent in their ability to communicate across cultures. Two forms of adaptation can exist. Cultural adaptation refers to the ability to consciously shift perspectives into an alternative cultural worldview. And behavioral adaptation enables people to shift into different frames without much conscious effort and then to act in culturally appropriate ways. It's at this stage then that we say that people are becoming bicultural or multicultural. A teacher at this stage, for instance, would understand that the needs of refugee students are quite different from those of international exchange students, even though they may both be from abroad, and they'll in turn respond differently to them. So we can use the IDI in a number of ways. We can use it to determine where our students are, certainly where we are, where our faculty are if we're at a college of education, where our college is, because we can use it to determine where an organization lies. We can track our graduates and see how they're evolving or developing over time. And we can take a look at where children tend to be. So there have been a number of studies that have looked at various groups using the IDI. A couple of studies that have been done with teachers over the years. Jenny Mahon surveyed 155 teachers in the Midwest about a decade ago. She found all of them were at minimization or below. She studied a group of 88 teachers in Nevada not long ago, found 84% of them being in minimization or below. David Grossman and his colleagues in Hong Kong surveyed 107 teachers, found 98% of them in minimization or below, and then surveyed 300 and some secondary teachers in Hong Kong, finding that the majority of them were in denial or polarization. At Kent State University, my own institution, we became the first university in the world to integrate the International Baccalaureate, or IB, into our undergraduate teacher education program for early childhood majors. So for the last 2 years, we've been using the IDI. We'll be using it as a pre and a post measure of the impact of that curriculum on them. So for the last 2 years, we've surveyed 157 early childhood majors. finding 91% of them in minimization and below, 9% of them on the ethno-relative side of the scale. We've also been assessing teacher education faculty in the program, and while we're doing a little bit better, the faculty seem to be doing a little bit better, still the majority of them are on the ethnocentric side of the scale, 71% in minimization and on 27% then in the ethno-relative side of the scale. There have been a couple of studies that have looked at young people in the past. Peterson did a study with 145 seventh graders, found 35% in high minimization and 35% in acceptance. And David Straffen surveyed 336 high school students in an international school in Malaysia. He found 97% on the ethno-relative side of the scale, with only 3% on the ethnocentric side of the scale. So now we do a little bit of head scratching here, and I've been calling this an intercultural conundrum, because we have teachers at one end of the scale, students a little bit farther along the progression. So then we begin to have to ask what's going on in the lives of students, what's going on in the lives of teachers that may give us this kind of results. I'll leave that for the dissertations of the future. But here we can use the IDI perhaps as a way to enhance intercultural competence by thinking developmentally and intentionally about how we can move our students along, particularly pre-service teachers, education students. So a goal might be to determine where on the continuum our students are likely to be, and then to consider some strategies that support the learners where they are without challenging them too much, but introducing them to developmentally appropriate strategies that challenge them and then support their growth. So remember, we say that intercultural development is evolutionary, not revolutionary, so we want to think developmentally along this line. So if we're moving students from denial to polarization, students then need to begin to make discriminations among cultures. So they need to be more sophisticated and knowledgeable about the differences of cultures. When we have individuals moving from polarization to minimization, they need to become more sophisticated in understanding the differences and recognize that all cultures have both good and some bad aspects to them. If we're going to move from minimization to acceptance, and again, this is the more challenging of the changes because people are saying the right things, there's a need to recognize that some differences do make a difference and to understand what some of those differences are. And at the same time, they need to learn to avoid projecting their own cultural orientation onto everybody else's experience. Moving from acceptance to adaptation, we need to help people develop the ability then to shift perspectives. And I want to draw here from some of the work in the field of cross-cultural training. Over the last 30 or 40 years, we've been analyzing effective ways to help people become more effective in moving across cultures. Primarily from the business community and the Peace Corps community is where these fields got their start. So we can have culture general orientation or culture specific orientation. For those of us in teacher education, we probably can't predict with exactly which specific cultures individuals are likely to encounter. So a culture general orientation may be more appropriate. And then the strategies, it can be didactic or cognitive, kind of a lecture approach, maybe what I'm doing right now, giving lots of information, up to experiential approaches, creating opportunities for people to encounter cross-cultural differences in the safety of a classroom. So understanding that intercultural development is an evolutionary and not a revolutionary process should greatly influence the manner in which we educate both children and teacher education students. Intercultural competence is not achieved in one course or in one single experience. Rather, it comes about after recognizing where one is on the developmental continuum and then providing both support and challenge, engage students in systematic, oftentimes repetitious, and well-planned exposure to intercultural interactions that nudge them to increasingly complex levels. Moving too quickly along the continuum might be like a scuba diver plunging immediately to a depth of 100 feet without taking the requisite time to equalize their pressure and accommodate to the new environment. The shock can just be too great for the body to accept. Alternatively, gradual movement or immersion enables the diver to adjust to the changing circumstances and thus to function more effectively in the new environment. So too should it be with intercultural development. Understanding and integrating what we know about intercultural development and sensitivity into the education of young people and teachers will result in a more culturally effective and culturally competent citizenry. So if we know where an individual lies on the continuum, we can be mindful of the particular strategies and experiences that can be utilized to move people from one stage to another. And the particular needs and approaches we might use when moving someone from denial to polarization can be significantly different from those that we would use when moving someone from minimization to acceptance. So we might just use the typical urban experience that is so common in teacher education. If many of our students are coming from suburban or rural environments, and most of the jobs and the needs and the understanding of the changing demographics are urban settings, it's not uncommon that we take our students into and give them experiences in urban settings. So the question here is, if we do it very early in the experience, are we perhaps doing it, are we going to perhaps reinforce or confirm some stereotypes and anxieties that they may already have, rather than considering when it might be best in their experience to give them significant experiences in environments or contexts that are very different from their own. So what follows next are just some ideas or suggestions of strategies and activities we might use dependent on the level of where students find themselves. So when we move from denial and defense, there's a need to recognize the existence of cultural differences and emphasize the common humanity, help people understand their similarities as well as differences. And we want them to become more tolerant of differences and to understand that all cultures have both good and bad aspects of it. And if the majority of our students, we say, are entering in denial and defense, these are some strategies and things we might do in the first year or two of our teacher education curriculum. So TED Talks is a wonderful field of resources for us. A number of them are very helpful at helping people get this sense of difference or common humanity, and I just listed a couple of them there. There's lots of children's literature that can be used to help develop this sense of perspective consciousness. Very favorite one is the story of the three little pigs as told by the wolf, and what really happened to Little Red Riding Hood as told by the wolf's perspective, helping children understand that there's another perspective that can be developed. There's general literature that can be used to help explore differences across cultures, and many of them can be school-based. There are a number of films that we can use to help our undergraduate students or our pre-service teachers get the sense of cultural difference around us. Long-term observations in culturally diverse settings are important, and I stress long-term. It's very easy to confirm pre-existing stereotypes if we make that quick 1 or 2 visit to an urban setting or to a culturally different school environment. So long-term observation in a culturally diverse setting would be critical, as well as some structured contact with selected people that are here to inform us. So panel presentations and visiting scholars and meetings with teachers of color, for instance, would be ways, and non-threatening ways, to help introduce multiple perspectives. And we might do some family tree exercises. Then a number of inventories can be used to look at the diversity that might exist within the group. So learning style inventories would be a good example of that, or vocational interest surveys help to develop that. And then there are a number of organizations and websites that are information rich that help to build a knowledge base and a perspective consciousness of the world around them. Moving from minimization, there's a need to develop cultural self-awareness and to learn to avoid projecting one's own culture onto everybody else's experience. And there are some more complex TED Talks that are available. Cultural assimilators or intercultural sensitizers are cross-cultural training tools that are designed to develop that attribution awareness or help people make similar attributions about the behavior of other people. You can find culture-specific assimilators, or I'm the co-author of a culture general assimilator on the book called Intercultural Interactions, a Practical Guide, which introduces the readers to 18 culture general themes that are found to be operating in a variety of cross-cultural interactions. And there are a number of cross-cultural simulations that have been very effective. Barnga being the classic cross-cultural simulation that's used, Bafa, and a number of others, that you can create cross-cultural conflicts or cross-cultural adjustment experiences within the safety of the classroom, and with ample time for debriefing them. And then we might think about sustained intercultural contact. Now we're talking 3rd or 4th year of a teacher education program. Conversation partners with international students on campus. Interactions with local communities. Immersion experiences in other cultural settings. Here we might be talking about overseas student teaching experiences, and so on. And then technological links have provided a number of opportunities for us to engage in long-term collaborative projects with people across the planet. A favorite of mine has been the development of partnership stories. Children or individuals in one country of the world begin the writing of a story, identify a storyline, characters, and a plot, build it up to a point of conflict, and then send that story to a group of children or students in another part of the world and ask them to complete the story. And when you're finished, you have a bilingual story that perhaps is co-illustrated. But nice joint projects that really can develop an understanding of cultural differences. So in summary, we're fortunate in teacher education that most of us work with students over a sustained period of time and thus can consider cultural learning long-term and programmatically. We know from a number of studies that most who enter the teaching profession perceive the world from an ethnocentric orientation. While we generally do not have the luxury of designing individualized intercultural education plans for teacher candidates, which we might refer to as IIEPs, we can have impact if we focus our efforts, at least in the early stages of teacher education, by integrating coordinated and sequential stage-appropriate cultural learning opportunities that support the majority of learners where they currently are while challenging them to learn and grow. We must begin building a foundation of acceptance, openness, and comfort with difference in a more strategic manner, making certain that all students understand how culture influences their own perception of the world, as well as how others have encountered difference. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. That was marvelous. I was scribbling down lots and lots of notes and just keeping track of some of the great references that you provided. And it's given a lot to think about as well. And I'm thinking also about what it would mean for leaders in colleges of education. If you were going to give them 3 suggestions on either where to start or what to do next for people that are just getting going, what would your recommendations be for those leading colleges of education? And I'm thinking about embedding intercultural awareness and international understanding into the curriculum. And you've given a lot of great ideas for opportunities along the way. But if somebody wanted to get going, what would you recommend?
One of the places I would begin would be to survey my own faculty. It's very common that faculty will have international experiences. Perhaps they've traveled or they've presented at conferences. But it's important to find the ones that have had significant intercultural experiences. And here we're generally talking about living and working within another cultural context for 6 months or longer. But I would begin to pool them. And I would begin to work at the program level. Because in teacher education, we struggle with the external demands from external accrediting agencies and state boards of education. But we can control our own program experiences and take a look at the ways that we are able to integrate intercultural experiences into the program as well as the cognitive experience. What readings are we doing?
I was at a meeting with the National Journal folks this morning, and it was talking about workforce development, and it was a really great discussion just around the issues of sort of preparing the next generation of workers in the United States at all levels. And there was this great conversation about how really every level is important, from early childhood through middle school, through that college experience. But one of the interesting factors that one of the folks, I want to say from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, brought out is that in 2012, we had 25% of our graduating seniors were Hispanic kids. And so, you know, I think that we're close to a shift in population, and yet our teaching staff isn't really reflective of that change, both from other data and then the data that you just presented. Can you think of any colleges in the United States that are using creative approaches to attract students with diverse backgrounds and diverse life experiences into teaching?
I know it's been an area that we've struggled with, certainly in my institution, for at least 2 decades, and we've had a number of nicely funded projects to diversify the teaching force. We've struggled in ways that many have struggled. We may be able to recruit underrepresented students into the university initially for teacher education, But then when many of them find themselves very successful and they say, well, why stay in teaching if I can go and make more money in engineering or business, and they jump out of education into other fields. And that's why that demographic of the demographics of teachers have not changed dramatically over the years, even with this incredible efforts. So in answer to your question, I could not name schools that have been necessarily effective at it. I don't know of any right now. Yeah.
Oh,
Sorry
okay.
about that. Yeah.
It's one of our challenges, I think, for the next decade to really figure out a way that teaching can be attractive enough, not only for university admission, but then also for some time in the classroom as well. I'm also thinking of, oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, if the reality is we're having a difficult time recruiting people of color into teaching, we have to really put our efforts into enhancing the experiences and backgrounds or experiences of those that are in the field. And that's where this internationalizing education and creating intercultural experiences for the pre-service teachers that we have is increasingly critical.
I totally agree. I totally agree. And I like how you've stacked it so that, you know, just someone starting out can have some exposure, but then grow deeper and deeper in opportunity as time progresses. Besides Kent, which I know does a great job with providing opportunities for dialogue and experiences abroad and in Ohio with some of the diverse communities, can you think of other programs around the country that might have some element of this that are doing great things and of note that we should be looking at and learning from?
Yeah, I think you should look at the University of San Diego and the work that they've been doing, particularly the cross-border work that they've been doing in Mexico over many years. Reyes Quesada and his team out there have been doing some very good work. In terms of international, the work of Laura Stokowski and her cultural programs, and Lee Martin's work at the University of Northern Iowa in terms of international experiences. Laura Stokowski's work has been embedded in the Navajo Reservation for many decades, and it's been a very powerful experience in creating awareness and understanding of domestic diversity issues for us.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And